Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. The terrorists that carried out the attacks in Paris and Brussels were known Islamic radicals. So how come counter-terror officials couldn't stop them? We'll talk about terror in Europe.
These individuals were on the radar. They were known to law enforcement and intelligence officials. Even with that information, they were able to really carry out large-scale, spectacular, catastrophic attacks.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Our domestic terror threat is bad here, but not as bad as Europe's. Over 5,000 Europeans have gone to join the Islamic State. Many others stay in Europe but are devoted to the jihadist cause. Just since 2015, there was the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Paris attacks, the Brussels attacks, mostly carried out by French or Belgian citizens and by terrorists already known by counter-terror officials. Some were even under surveillance. The European security services are understaffed, under-resourced, and just plain dysfunctional. Frontline PBS and Propublica journalist Sebastian Rotella have produced a documentary called Terror in Europe about the jihadist cells operating in France and Belgium and the stunning failures of the security services. Sebastian, welcome.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So one Belgian counter-terror official says to you that this is the start of a new era. What did he mean?
He meant that really, if you go back in time, back to around when the Charlie Hebdo attacks and other attacks in that era, that there was almost an offensive launched based out of Syria, mainly by ISIS, and driven by the Syrian jihad, where you have this new phenomenon, which is radicalization driven by the Syrian jihad in numbers that are unprecedented in Europe or anywhere. You're talking about thousands of people going and joining mainly ISIS in Syria, and radicalization in Europe itself, and thousands more people caught up in this hyper-violent propaganda of ISIS, and that has just unleashed this offensive that, as you described the attacks, there have been others, and for all those attacks, a lot of small attacks and foiled plots. ISIS in particular really overwhelmed the defenses of Europe with the number of people it trained, sent back, and inspired.
They weren't expecting it at all, though?
I think, look, they were expecting it, but if you look at the numbers, it was almost exponential, right? I mean, when Syria began, people were worried. But the numbers they saw, say, in the first year were comparable to what you had seen in other theaters like Afghanistan or people going during to Iraq in the mid-2000s. What happened was just that the numbers skyrocketed. Syria was closer to get to, it was cheaper, it was easier. And that kind of propaganda, the ISIS appeal was particularly sinister and effective in its use of social media and modern technology, and that violence and that barbarity, which unfortunately appeals to a whole sector of people, many of them people already involved in violent crime, who join the cause. So that's really what's driving this.
So Europol says that about 5,000 European citizens have gone to fight in Iraq and Syria. He estimates about a third have come back. How do they not even know how many have come back?
They have a pretty good sense because they're tracking the networks in Europe and in Syria are in constant communication. So you have a lot of movement, and they have a pretty good count. But people are moving. I mean, it's remarkable how easy it was, and to some extent still is, though obviously it's gotten tougher now with the offensive on ISIS. But for those couple of years, people were renting cars in Holland or in France and driving to Syria and joining ISIS, coming back.
You could do that?
You could do that. I mean, there are intercepts where they trace people, the families, entire families driving through Italy to Greece and joining to Syria to join ISIS. There was just all this movement back and forth. And as we show in the film, the borders are so weak that you have people, even wanted people on watch lists, able to use fake documents to move back and forth or to join the refugee flow. So they have a pretty good sense on the numbers, but there is this constant movement, and then you're trying to figure out who's alive. A lot of people obviously are dying on the battlefield. You have people talking about going who disappear, but it's not clear if they made it or where they are. So there's a reasonably good sense of this population, but there are some unknowns there.
They're saying that every week people are coming back from Syria. What are they supposed to do?
That's the problem. I mean, they're pretty good at building cases, right? I mean, what they do is, luckily you have a generation of people who feel that in order to exist, they have to document what they do on and communicate back on WhatsApp and Twitter and Telegram and things like that. So, people end up documenting a lot of their crimes, but it's very difficult. So some people, what is going on now in particular is building cases against people who they know are there, so when they come back, they can be arrested. But there are going to be others who they have maybe even a strong evidence that they were in Syria, but not that they were actually involved in terrorism. What do you do with them? They were talking about, for example, in France about sort of court-mandated rehabilitation camps, things like that. That's something that's being discussed. It hasn't happened yet. But other people you're just going to have to watch. But then, as we talk about in the film, how many people can you watch full time, right? And what does watching mean? It might mean, as you see in the film, there were a couple of people involved in the attacks who were being theoretically monitored in the days and weeks before the attacks as they were preparing them. But that meant there was a camera outside their house, or there was an attempt to debug their phones. But following someone around is not easy.
I was surprised that they don't even share intelligence among the EU countries.
They share intelligence, but what we try to show, they share it on a case-by-case basis. So if you remember in the film, there's a couple of specific cases where there's a specific alert on an individual, often from U.S. high-tech intelligence, which is shared with the French, who communicate with the Spanish, and in real time they do a great operation and grab those individuals. So their intelligence sharing works well, but that's on a specific case where there's almost like a negotiation. I have this, you have that, let's work together. But what I think we showed in this film is that systematically, because the European Union is all these different countries, all these different laws, all these different intelligence and police services with different attitudes towards sharing, intelligence agencies in particular don't necessarily like to share, it's not systematic. And above all, there aren't databases like happens in the U.S. federal government, where you can go into a computer in Hungary and find out about somebody being wanted in Belgium. They're just great reticence
like an
about that.
IT problem almost.
Right.
Like this guy was on this database, but this guy only checked this database, and these systems don't talk to each other. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous, though.
It is, and everyone realizes it has to change. One of the anecdotes that is alluded to in our film, and that we tell more in depth in a written story, is that the former head of the National Counterterrorism Center, Matthew Olson, he says in 2014, as the American intelligence services started to realize how many Europeans were going to Syria, how dangerous that ISIS was, and how the Americans really needed to have a handle on it because it's very easy for Europeans to fly into the United States, that they worked with each European country to assemble a master list of European jihadis known or suspected of going to Syria. And what they realized by the end of that process is that the U.S. had a better list of European jihadis than the European Union, its equivalent, did, which is just, remarkable.
But why is that?
Because,
is it because
again,
they didn't really take it that seriously?
I think they took it, again, we're being critical, but obviously some of these services like the French and the British and the Spanish and the Italians are very good on their own territory, but the larger issue of the 28 countries of the European Union sitting down and trying to work together and have systems when there are different countries with different languages and different cultures, and the European Union just doesn't work the way the United States of America does, right? So that's the big breakdown. And the bad guys, the terrorists, know all these gaps and these contradictions in the system, and they fully exploit them.
130 people were killed in the attacks. Most of the suspected plotters were already known to the authorities, and multiple opportunities to stop them had been missed. At least 6 were wanted on international arrest warrants for terrorism. 1 was under police surveillance with wiretaps and a hidden camera. At least 7 were on terrorist watch lists. At least 12 were stopped, questioned, and even arrested as they traveled around Europe and back and forth to Syria to prepare the Paris plot.
These individuals were on the radar. They had traveled to Syria. They were known to law enforcement and intelligence officials. Even with that information in the hands of intelligence and law enforcement, they were able to really carry out large-scale, spectacular, catastrophic-style attacks, because law enforcement and Border Patrol officials from one country simply don't communicate with their counterparts in another country in a way that would make information that they possess actionable and, really disrupt or stop a terrorist from moving across their border.
So there's a guy named Kouachi, and he was one of the guys that would go on to carry out the Charlie Hebdo massacre. He flies to Yemen to join Al-Qaeda, and then he comes back. There isn't a no-fly list for him to not be able to get on an airplane, even though he was already convicted of terrorism charges?
There may be lists, but there's not a Europe-wide one. There was great resistance in Europe to doing what we do, which is screening passengers ahead of time. We have what's called passenger name record, where since 2001, what the U.S. government does is it has access to information about passengers 72 hours before they fly, and there are targeted teams that sit and go through those lists and see, do they have connections, are they on watch lists, all that. And Europe only passed a law like that despite repeated attempts by the security forces to institute it after 10 years after the Brussels attacks. So during the period that he flies and many others are flying, The Europeans have much less ability to screen people. And in his case, what he did was, because he was a convicted terrorist, mind you, he had spent time already in prison, was use his brother's passport. Fly to Yemen and come back posing as his brother. Something that is much harder in the U.S. because whether or not you realize the ruse, you would see that this was a convicted terrorist getting on this plane, right? But that whole system is really a big problem, which the European Parliament finally recognized after the Brussels attacks and passed a law that will create a similar system. Those lists will then be used because the authorities will be systematically screening people with more data and more time. But the problem is there's just a fundamentally different view in Europe, at least in some European countries, of privacy. And there was this idea that this is an assault on privacy, you know.
Hypersensitive to privacy.
Hypersensitive, particularly in some countries. And the problem in Europe is those 28 countries have to agree on measures like this. And if a couple don't, it affects the whole system. I think most reasonable European sort of politicians, and certainly people in the intelligence and law enforcement, say that privacy is important, but this is a basic measure which is used in the United States, and we need to use it too.
So this guy Kouachi had gone to Yemen, joined Al-Qaeda. He came back to France and then pledged allegiance to ISIS. So it would seem that the allegiances between Al-Qaeda and ISIS are pretty fluid in Europe.
Yeah, and that case is actually an interesting sort of transition case from the Al-Qaeda generation to the ISIS generation. So Kouachi and a couple of the other people in that group were people who had been with Al-Qaeda and actually had gone to Iraq in the mid-2000s, sort of been radicalized and been part of Al-Qaeda. They joined forces with a guy named Ahmadi Coulibaly, who's part of this who had been radicalized with them in prison, but by the time the plot is sort of happening, his connection is to ISIS because that's what's sort of the happening culture on the street. So you have a weird case where ISIS and Al-Qaeda theoretically at a geopolitical level are rivals, but the Kouachis declare their attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine in the name of Al-Qaeda, and Coulibaly declares it in the name of ISIS. But they're working together because what's more important to them
it doesn't really matter in
because
Europe.
they're friends from childhood, they're friends from prison, they're friends from the neighborhood, and no matter what the quote-unquote bosses back in Syria and Yemen are, competing about, what's important are these street-level bonds, and that makes it even more confusing and difficult for the intelligence services to figure out, who's doing what and who was working for whom.
Well, you mentioned prison. It seems that European prisons are just breeding grounds for more terrorism.
There are two problems. One is what you just said. It was absolutely true. Radicalization is very intense. You have a mixing of common criminals and veteran jihadis who in prison have an aura of great respect and sort of they're admired figures and they have a lot of influence and they radicalize. You have common criminals more than ever crossing the line into jihadism, number one. But number two, what we try to show in this film that people don't really talk about, except my sources who've been telling me for years, we have this problem with short prison sentences for terrorism. You have people say, in the case of the people who did the Charlie Hebdo attacks, 3 or 4 individuals, key individuals who had done things like go to Iraq and fight and be captured on the battlefield in Fallujah fighting for Al-Qaeda, or be involved in a plot to break a dangerous terrorist out of prison, and they serve 2 or 3 or 4 years in prison. I mean, very short sentences because
But why? I mean, that would have never happened in the U.S.
Right, in the U.S. they would have served 15 minimum and probably a lot more. But the problem is that the French system, which is very tough on the front end, they're very good at locking people up sort of, on charges of terrorism. And in some ways they have more strength than the Americans do in terms of showing a conspiracy. But when it comes to convicting people, in Europe, there's just a whole different attitude towards how long people spend time in prison. The sentences are shorter. So in this case, because the French justice system is underfunded and overwhelmed, a lot of people who are charged with conspiracy to commit terrorist acts but haven't killed anyone are judged in the same courts as drug dealers and robbers, and the maximum sentence is 10 years, and you end up serving about half that. So there's no one in this group of a dozen people from which the Kouachis came out of who had been involved in the jihad in Iraq served more than 7 years. Several of them are now dangerous chiefs of ISIS, involved in executions and plotting in Syria. And what the very frustrated police and intelligence officials tells us is, we did all this work to put these guys in prison and they're back on the street. And there's case after case like that.
And it just seems that they never really thought that, well, these guys that are fighting overseas would ever pose a threat here. Like, they're killing people over there, it's not really our problem here.
I think that's right, or certainly there wasn't a sense of urgency about them or about doing things like what they're talking about now, which is, it's not a question of mass incarceration, but if we have determined there's strong evidence that someone spent time overseas fighting with a terrorist group, we need to put them away for long enough that they're going to be out of commission for a while.
One of the terrorists in the film is a guy named Abaaoud. Tell us about him.
Abdelhamid Abaaoud is a Belgian Moroccan who's one of the key sort of ground level figures in the Paris and Brussels attacks. He leads that team that attacks Paris and carries out that terrible attack that kills 130 people. And he had been very active in Syria in the months leading up to those attacks in sending a wave of European recruits who would sort of come in and do express training, and he would recruit and send them back to attack mainly France. And he was a very important figure for several reasons. Number one, because of that coordinating role. Though he wasn't the mastermind, there were people above him. But number two, he's very symptomatic of this new phenomenon, which is you have French and Belgian, mainly young men, almost all of them coming out of violent crime. Some of them like bona fide gangsters, and others, he was more of a small-time criminal, who have these incredible networks that mix extremism and crime, which didn't used to be as much the case back in the Al-Qaeda days, early 2000s, mid-2000s. You had people, many people who were criminals would become jihadis, but the networks were more separate. Now there's an incredible intermingling, and he used that incredibly well to recruit. You know, we're talking about 24 people who carry out the Paris and Brussels attacks, most of them trained in Syria. He very skillfully, along with others, young men, they're in their late 20s, early 30s like him, in Syria, who ISIS pretty much gives the Europeans a lot of autonomy to carry out attacks. So they attack the places they know well, and they use the criminal networks and the streets they know to put all this together.
So a French prosecutor and judge says that he was shocked at how much Abaaoud hated France and wanted to hurt them. I find that very naive from somebody in his position.
In other words, I think what he was saying there was not just the intention, but that how industriously he was working at it. I don't know if it was the hatred of Europe. I think he sees that a lot. But what he felt was this guy had a project, and that ISIS had a project. And they had created this external operations cell that was sending as many as 200 people are sent in that a year-and-a-half period leading up to the attack to try to attack Europe. I think he was stunned by the determination and the sort of almost this machinery that was sending people, and how important this guy Abaaoud, who was ultimately this small-time criminal who only radicalized a few years ago, was in that, right? I mean, I think that took, the intensity of the onslaught took everyone aback.
So November 13, 2015, the attacks in Paris happened. Some of the attackers were known to security officials, and some of them were under surveillance. And we talked a little bit about this. You said that, well, what does that really mean? Maybe just a camera. I mean, the guy's under surveillance and you don't see that he's about to do this major attack?
A couple of things about that. I should say that, as you know, I've covered most of the major attacks since 9/11. And in almost all of those cases, we all go through this exercise, and journalists do it, and sometimes it's fair and sometimes it isn't. But almost always there was some knowledge ahead of time. Looking back, you say, aha, we were watching this guy.
It could have been
Or
stopped.
aha, there was this phone call. Now we understand how that fits into the puzzle. The difference here is, in this case, is that, as I told you, that we're talking about 24 people involved in this plot. Almost all of them, I would say, with the exception of two, were known at some level to the intelligence services. They were, as you said, some were actually under surveillance. A number of them had warrants on them. That meant if they came into contact with the police, they needed to be arrested immediately for terrorism. And many were on watch lists. Yet they were able to go back and forth to Syria and move around Europe, and at least a dozen of them were stopped, questioned, and even arrested during that period, yet they were somehow able to slide out of it. Why? Number one, because of all those dysfunctions I was telling you about, how easy it is to get back and forth across borders using fake documents, sliding into the refugee flow, the lack of strong databases so people get stopped by cops in one country who don't realize that this guy has a warrant on him in another. All that played into it, you know, and then again, the sheer numbers. There just weren't the resources when this fellow who was being watched, there's a camera outside his house, Mohammed Abrini in Brussels, that films him as he gets into a car and drives off to join the convoy of a dozen guys who go to Paris to attack 2 days later. But there weren't police and cars physically following them. If there had been, they would have seen that.
The Paris attacks were planned and directed out of Belgium, and one French prosecutor called Belgium, quote, the weakest link.
Belgium, like a number of other small countries, particularly in Northern Europe, has a problem, and a deep-seated one. There are countries that have very well-intentioned, civilized, you know, sort of laws that put great restrictions on the police and the intelligence services, and great emphasis on privacy and short prison sentences and all that, which are fine, but they're a bit outdated. Particularly in a country like Belgium, which since the 1990s has had incredibly active terrorism networks. I mean, as you know, we're talking about going back to the cases of 9/11, the assassination of Massoud in Afghanistan, networks sending people to Somalia, to Iraq. They all come back repeatedly to Belgium. But because there was never an actual attack in Belgium, the security services, you know, were never given the budgets they needed. The intelligence service in Belgium couldn't do wiretaps of people until 2008. In the past couple of years, as the Syria jihad was exploding, every unit, prosecution, federal police, et cetera, had to double and triple in size. the political class just didn't seem to realize what was going on the streets of Belgium in terrorism and in violent crime.
I want to read you something from the Daily Beast. They reported a senior U.S. intelligence official saying after the Brussels attacks, quote, "Even with the EU in general, there's an infiltration of jihadists that have been happening for 2 decades, and now they're just starting to work on this. When you have to contact these people or send our guys over to talk to them, we're essentially talking with people who are, I'm just going to put it bluntly, children. They are not proactive. They don't know what's going on. They're in such denial. It's such a frightening thing to admit their country is being taken over." Is this denial?
I remember that quote from that period and a lot of quotes like it, and I have mixed feelings about it because I know some very courageous, talented, and knowledgeable law enforcement officials in Belgium and certainly in France and Spain and Italy. I mean, I've learned more about them, about Islamic terrorism from them than I have anyone else.
I'm sure there's good people there, but it's the system is messed up.
The system is the problem. And what's odd is they know more about Islamic extremism than many American counterparts because they deal with it more on an ongoing basis. But it's true that this sense of urgency was lacking. That's the main thing, this sense of urgency. And there's a view that this failure to understand what was happening, and particularly in Belgium, is at its peak, I think, of this intermingling of crime and extremism and how dangerous it is. Just to give you an example, the terrorist units in Belgium were overwhelmed by the workload, so they brought in the sort of best police units which did anti-gang, anti-organized crime work. And they knew all the suspects. They were the same suspects. There was all the guys who they considered terrorists had also been involved in violent crime and organized crime. And I think the political class is only now realizing and waking up to how dangerous and how profound that is as a problem in their society.
Do you feel like they're going to make some changes? I mean, after 9/11, everything changed for us. So have they reached critical mass yet on that?
I think the comparison is a very good one. The mood is not unlike after 9/11 when we sat down and re-examined all these issues. And so that is going on in Europe, and there certainly has been some progress. The passage of the law I mentioned to you on airline screening, an attempt to toughen border agencies, more work on databases and systematic sharing. So certainly everyone agrees that they had a huge problem. They're now trying to confront it, and there is some effort. But it's still a complex bureaucracy. It's still hard to get anything done. And there is a countercurrent, unfortunately, I'm told by people I know there in intelligence law enforcement, which is there's still reticence to share. There's things like the Brexit, where borders are kind of moving up and not going down. And so countries on the one hand are saying we need to share, we need to work together, but others are saying if this isn't going to work as a collective, we're out of here. We're out of here, and we're going to take care of our own territory.
Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think the UK is going to be more secure leaving the European Union?
I don't, not necessarily, because I think the UK already was half out anyway, right? They still had borders, right, and they still had their own systems, and they cooperated the same way we do, right? And we're over here with the Europeans very effectively. So I don't know if that's the problem, but I think what everyone has to do is realize that this is an emergency and that the European Union, which in some ways has worked marvelously in terms of the currency and people being able to move back and forth in workplaces, needs to become a real entity with a real-time capacity on questions of security and justice, because that is what's sorely lacking.
You had mentioned this before, kind of a Jihadist Anonymous de-radicalization program. Has that been happening? Is there plans for that? Do we know if it's going to be useful?
Everyone is talking about that. That's the huge issue because of the sheer number of people and what you do with them and what happens when these people come back from Syria and the number of people who are radicalized in these societies. A couple different things. Everyone agrees that there has to be a lot of work, not unlike work that we do in our cities of prevention, like preventing people from going into gangs, the equivalent for radicalization, right? Getting people when they're 12 and 13 and 14, and really trying to work on that and intervening when there are signs of radicalization. And then there's the much more difficult problem about which there's much more debate, which is people who are radicalized and actually have come back from a combat zone and what you do with them. There are some pretty hard-nosed, though thoughtful people, say in France, who tell me, game over. Look at these cases. Look how many people we put in prison. They came back out worse, right? Yeah. I mean, let's not be soft with them. But there are others who are saying, well, there's this gray area of people that you can't put away forever because you can't prove that they committed crimes. So everyone's talking about the best approach, but that is going to be a huge challenge from society to society, particularly the societies that have a lot of people. There have been some experiments in Denmark, for example, that they say have worked pretty well.
A phrase that was used several times in the film was that these people are, quote, time bombs. That means more attacks are coming.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right, and I think what the film shows, and what this sort of most recent chapter of this ongoing story of the jihad over the past decade and a half in Europe shows, is that people can sort of sit idle or have been involved in it, spend some time in prison, and then seem to be not that involved. But when a new theater erupts or a new cause erupts, they sort of go back into it. So yes, there are a lot of people who are, the term is a good one, who are time bombs. And the problem is that there are those people who are sort of veterans right now, but there's also radicalization is so fast now, right? The process is so fast, and people radicalize in a way that we almost have to change our definition of it, because they can, as you see in people involved in these attacks, within months go from being sort of guys who smoke and drink and gamble, and continue to smoke and drink and gamble, but become terrorists and carry out attacks without really changing their lifestyle. And for them, the religion is more of a veneer, more of a pretext for sort of this embrace of hyperviolence and nihilism. So that is the other problem. These people who have been doing it for a while, who are dangerous, and the potential that radicalization works more quickly than ever, and that attacks can happen very quickly by people who weren't really that involved just months before.
Sebastian, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.